A lot of you have been asking me to take a look at Cachy OS for a long time, and that video is finally done. So let's talk about that distro that has been taking the Linux gaming world by storm recently. So we'll start by taking a look at what makes Cachy OS different on paper, and then we'll do a bunch of benchmarks for CPU scores, for disk speeds, for network speeds, and of course for gaming, to see if Cachy OS is just hype or if it's actual better performance. We'll test all of this as well on a review unit that Tuxedo sends me, which I'll talk about along the way. And I'll also talk about our sponsor, Joplin. So this video is sponsored by Joplin. They're an open source note-taking application that focuses on flexibility and privacy. So on Linux we have tons of note-taking apps, but Joplin currently has my preference because they are fully open source and fully private. They are designed to work offline first. Your notes are always available. You don't need an internet connection. You have all the features available without any third-party services. It's also available on all major platforms: Windows, macOS, Android, iOS, and of course Linux, so you can sync your notes between all your devices. You can take notes with rich text, markdown, you can have voice notes, you can have voice dictation, you can add drawings or sketches. And when it comes to syncing your notes, you can just sync the notes that you create through Joplin, but you can also access Joplin Cloud, which is their own service to let you sync stuff between devices. Joplin Cloud allows you to synchronize your notes securely between all your devices. You can try it for free for 14 days, and it also comes with note sharing, collaboration, letting you publish your notes online for documentation, or even completely transfer an email into a note immediately. So if you want a secure, open source and private note-taking application for Linux that syncs everywhere, you have Joplin. The link is down in the description, and you can even use the code LinuxExperiment to get 25% off if you subscribe to their Joplin Cloud plan. So I am late to the Cachy OS party, so we'll go over what makes it different very quickly, because all that info is very widely available. So Cachy OS is of course an Arch-based Linux distro. It advertises better performance than a default Arch system, using optimizations at the compiler level, meaning better optimized packages for recent computers, also meaning it probably won't run on older PCs. You also have optimizations at the kernel level itself. They have their own scheduler for handling the CPU and how it handles multi-threading, and a bunch of other things on top of that, which should theoretically yield better performance than a default Arch install. Cachy OS is also much more user-friendly than Arch because it has a graphical installer using the tried and tested Calamares, so you do not have to learn how to install Arch or to use a terminal-based install script, which, yes, it's not that hard, but it is a barrier, and I would argue it is absolutely not really necessary these days. Cachy also offers every desktop environment or tiling window manager you might want to use, including Plasma, GNOME, Cosmic, Sway, Neri, XFC, and more. They are all supported by the distro. You can pick the one you want at install, and you also get a choice of additional packages if you want multiple desktops or multiple tiling window managers installed at once. You also have a few more options for printer support and that stuff. You also have a specific version for gaming handhelds, but we'll look at the full-fat desktop version because that was just easier for benchmarks. On top of that, Cachy OS comes with custom applications. They have a graphical package manager called Shelly, which supports the AUR, Flatpak, and app images. It looks more like Synaptic than GNOME software, but it is very easy to use and very handy. They also have their own welcome app for quick fixes and tweaks at startup. They have their own kernel manager to install and optimize and configure various kernels graphically. They have their tool to automatically pick the right mirror for the repos to get the best download speeds, and they can also work with systemd boot, although at install you will get a choice of the boot manager that you want to use, Grub, systemd, Limine, or Limine, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, or a bunch of others. Cachy OS also has a pretty solid documentation base to address most questions, the install process, configuring the system, and configuring their own tools. Basically, it is Arch Linux, but pre-configured, easier to install, and of course, way more optimized with a nicer, more user-friendly selection of default apps and packages and tools on top of that. So let's see whether Cachy OS actually outperforms Arch, or if it's mostly just hype. So all of this will be tested on a laptop that Tuxedo sent me for review. They're not sponsoring this video, by the way. This is the Tuxedo InfinityBook Max 16, which is a beast of a laptop with a Core Ultra 9 2700HX, 16 gigs of RAM by default, an RTX 5060 with 8 gigs of VRAM, and a 500 gigs SSD. That's the review unit they send me. Of course, you can configure it up to 128 gigs of RAM, 16 terabytes of storage, and even an RTX 5070. It is a 16 inches device. My review unit has an OLED display, which we'll talk about at the end of the video. Important to be noted, this laptop is fully upgradable. You can replace the Wi-Fi chip, you can replace the SSD, you can replace the RAM, and you can even replace the battery. It is not soldered, so it is an upgradable and repairable laptop in a lot of ways. Now, you also have a timestamp right here on screen if you want to know more about that laptop directly. It's going to be at the end of the video, but I also cover a few features along the way as we talk about them when they're relevant to the actual benchmarks or tests that I'm running. So do watch the video, and if you're really interested in the laptop, here's the timestamp to go check out what I think about it. Now let's get on with the actual numbers. So all of these tests were done on KDE, on Arch, and CachyOS, both with fully up-to-date systems, and will measure performance with Geekbench, KDiskMark, speedtest.net, and some game benchmarks. All of this, of course, is done on the InfinityBook Max 16. Everything is plugged in with the max performance profile with an Ethernet cable plugged in too. Arch was installed using Arch install with the official NVIDIA drivers, the bog standard recommended partition layout using ext4, and the Plasma Meta recommended package for Plasma. No additional configs were changed. CachyOS was installed with the official NVIDIA drivers as well. I defaulted to ext4 for a fair comparison. CachyOS does default to BetterFS. You can pick ext4 from the list of file systems. Since Arch was installed using ext4, I decided to use the same file system on CachyOS to have the right results and not benchmark the actual file system instead of the actual performance optimizations of the system. So let's begin with Geekbench 6. On Arch, running that benchmark yielded a single core score of 3284 and a multi-core score of 16,551. That's for the Intel Core Ultra 9 275HX, which is a 12-core CPU with 24 logical cores, compared to my current laptop, which has a Core i7-13700H that is 23% higher for single core and 69% higher in multi-core, which is nice. And that CPU on the laptop is the one I use to record and edit all my videos. It is not slow, so that Core Ultra 9 is an absolute beast. On CachyOS, Geekbench 6 also downloaded from the developer's website and ran using the console, got 3269 in single core and 16,674 in multi-core. This small difference maintained over 5 runs of Geekbench 6. Basically, it's no difference at all. It is very slightly lower in single core and about as much higher in multi-core. I think it is 0.5% in favor of Arch in single core and 0.7% in favor of CachyOS in multi-core. Basically no difference here. I was expecting a little bit better performance from CachyOS because technically they do have a better scheduler that is optimized for making your CPU a bit more powerful, but for Geekbench 6 at least it doesn't seem to apply. Next, we're on to gaming benchmarks, arguably the most important stuff since CachyOS uses their own scheduler, which optimizes specifically for gaming. So I ran Horizon Zero Dawn, the Cyberpunk 2077 benchmark, and the Total War Warhammer 3 benchmarks. They were all run using Proton, even those that have native Linux versions, and I used, of course, the dedicated NVIDIA 5060 GPU with the latest NVIDIA drivers available on both distros, which seem to be the exact same version. Makes sense. Arch, CachyOS is based on Arch. They have kind of the same package versions in there. And yes, these games will report that they are running on Windows 10 Pro. That's what you get when you run a game with Proton. The game doesn't know it's running Linux, that's the point. I know someone will make a comment about that. It's normal. When you run a game with Proton, it will tell you you're running on Windows. To be noted, on CachyOS by default, I could not run a single game. They all started with a black screen and a mouse pointer on top of them. I had to install lib32glue to fix that, which is a 32-bit library that was missing from the default install. On Arch, I didn't have to do that. Doesn't seem to be a widespread problem, but it was a problem for me. So, on Arch, I ran the Cyberpunk benchmark at 2880 by 1800 with the maximum ray tracing ultra preset and DLSS set to auto for quality. That got me 24 FPS on average with a minimum of 21.3 and a maximum of 27.6 with pretty choppy frame rate. Going to 1600p but dropping too high with FSR automatically set to quality got me 58.2 FPS on average with a minimum of 50 and a max of 67.6, much more acceptable in terms of gameplay experience. Now if we compare that to Cachy OS, testing with all settings maxed out got me an average of 28 FPS with a minimum of 25.1 and a max of 31. That is a 16% improvement for Cachy OS compared to regular Arch, with a frame rate that felt much smoother to watch, fewer stutters, although there were still some. Running the game at 1600p and high settings got me 49.27 FPS on average with a minimum of 33.8 and a max of 70.9, which is strange because that is 16% lower on average than on Arch, with a better max FPS but a lower minimum FPS and more stutters as well in-game. I reran the benchmark multiple times, I triple checked the settings, I rebooted the entire computer and restarted the game, didn't change a thing. CachyOS performs better at higher settings and higher resolution on Cyberpunk, but it performs worse than Arch at lower settings. I have no idea why. Also, why is Cyberpunk defaulting to FSR when you're running on an NVIDIA GPU if you go to their automatic presets? I don't know. I don't really understand how that's possible. If the game is faster with higher settings, it should also likely be faster at lower settings, but in this case, CachyOS lagged behind Arch at lower settings, which sucks because those lower settings are what this device is actually capable of doing, 1440p with high details. Now for Horizon Zero Dawn, on Arch Linux, I ran the benchmark at the maximum resolution of 2880 by 1800 at ultimate quality settings, without any resolution scaling enabled. That got me 50 FPS on average, with a max of 136 and a minimum of 23, and it felt pretty smooth to watch. Compared to CachyOS, the same benchmark at the same graphics details got 58 FPS on average, with a max of 138 and a minimum of 35. That is a 16% improvement over Arch on average, again, with overall a smoother frame rate, at least visually. That is a pretty big improvement too, with the same settings. Do remember, same file system, same drivers, same hardware, same performance profile, same config, same packaging format for Steam installed through Flatpak, and it gives you 16% better performance with a distro that is easier to install than Arch. Now for Total War Warhammer 3, I ran using the Windows version through Proton because the Linux version has some issues with black textures that don't show up and don't work these days. At ultra settings and the maximum resolution of 2880 by 1800, I got 31.3 FPS on average in the battle benchmark, which is pretty great because this can be a quite demanding game with a minimum FPS of 24 and a max of 38. At more reasonable settings, 1440p and high instead of ultra, the game reached 47.9 FPS on average, with a low of 37 and a high of 59 FPS. Much more playable, but still not perfect. Now on CachyOS, at 2880 by 1800 at ultra setting, the game got 40 FPS on average compared to the 31.3 on Arch, with a minimum of 30 and a max of 48. That is 27% higher on average than default Arch Linux, with better lows and also far less stuttering in-game. The frame rate was much smoother in CachyOS. At 1440p and high settings, the game got all the way up to 59.9 FPS on average, compared to the 48 FPS on Arch, with a minimum of 46 and a max of 73. That is a 25% improvement on average over Arch, again with much smoother frame rate overall. That is an insane difference. I triple checked the settings to see if I messed something up, but I didn't. CachyOS just has much better performance in this game, potentially because it is very CPU bound. It really depends on your CPU. It can really stutter and lag at times if you don't have enough cores that go high enough. And CachyOS seems to really be perfect for that kind of approach, because on that game, it's a 26% performance difference on average, which is massive. Now this was all ran on an RTX 5060, the laptop of course can get up to a 5070 with 8 gigs of VRAM in both cases. I know 8 gigs of VRAM can feel a bit low for high-end gaming. Recent AAA titles tend to require more than that, maybe 12 to 16 gigs. Honestly, 8 gigs of VRAM, that's what I have on all my devices except my desktop. It's really more than enough for 1440p gaming. For 4K, maybe not, but hey, if a game requires more than 8 gigs of VRAM, ask the developers to optimize it because they're not doing their job. Now, there is no AMD card option on that laptop, which unfortunately is extremely rare on any laptop. Dedicated AMD GPUs on laptops, you just don't see many of those. I would like to see them come back, but for now it's mostly Nvidia everywhere. To be noted, everything I ran here was on Wayland using that RTX 5060. I didn't experience a single issue with that. Nvidia support on Linux is really not as bad as it once was, especially on KDE. Not as good as with AMD, but not bad. Now, if we compare Arch to CachyOS on gaming, Cachy does deliver a lot of improvements here. I was extremely surprised. I was expecting 1, 2, maybe 5% improvements here and there, not consistently. This delivered basically 16% flat. Granted, it's only 3 games. Those are not the most modern games out there, although Cyberpunk can be very demanding. The only outlier is that Cyberpunk benchmark at lower settings, which runs worse on CachyOS than on Arch. I don't really know why that is, but everything else was 16% better up to 27% better for Total War Warhammer 3. I guess it will mostly depend on how much your game is CPU bound, because that's where Cachy brings the improvements, but for all titles it should give you a nice benefit. If you were struggling to hit 60, CachyOS will probably help with that. Also important, the frame rate looks way smoother on CachyOS than on Arch. You have fewer micro stutters, the lower FPS numbers are generally higher on Cachy than on Arch, and everything just feels smoother. It feels like the frame timings are better on Cachy than on Arch, which is also very important for the perceived performance of the entire thing. Now, in those benchmarks, you can hear the laptop's fan spinning, but it's not extremely noticeable or annoying. It is quite silent for such a powerful device, which was pretty nice because it is extremely hot right now where I live, and having that thing blow out hot hair everywhere would suck. Now, for disk speeds, I ran KDiskMark using the default profile. Here are the results side by side, and as you can see, in most instances, Arch is faster, much faster than CachyOS, which felt really strange to me. So I thought about it, but turns out I ran the KDiskMark benchmarks on Arch when it was the only system installed on disk, so it has a much larger partition and fewer files around, where CachyOS I ran the benchmark after I installed it on a dual boot with Arch, meaning it had a smaller partition with more files. So what I did is fully reinstall CachyOS on the entire disk, and I reran all of those tests, and the results are far different. So in the first test, which is the sequential 1 meg test, it measures how well the system writes and reads data in 1 meg chunks. Here it is doing 8 requests at the same time using a single thread, and CachyOS outperforms Arch in there by a large margin in both reads and write speeds. This test basically represents accessing one large file, so stuff like video editing, like moving around a big single file, or maybe loading a big game asset like a giant texture. And in there, CachyOS seems faster than Arch. The second test is the same. It's reading or writing data in 1 meg chunks, except it's one operation at a time in a single thread. Here, CachyOS basically matches Arch. The numbers aren't really significantly different. It's quite the same. This represents stuff like a basic single file transfer, or maybe playing a large video file, that kind of stuff. The third test is randomly reading or writing small files that are 4 kilobytes in size. This is the sort of stuff you'll encounter when multitasking, when running a VM, when doing some dev work. Basically, every time you save a small file, something updates in the background, some cache is written, that sort of stuff. Here, CachyOS matches Arch in read speeds, but it is much slower in write speeds. I can't really figure out why, but this discrepancy was also present when I ran the test with both systems on a dual boot, so I'm guessing some of the stuff that they change in their kernel, maybe in the latency, do affect the performance of actually writing many small files all around the disk. And the final fourth test is the same, but doing so one operation at a time, where the previous test did 3 operations in parallel. Here, CachyOS has basically the same performance as Arch, slightly lower, slightly higher numbers, but basically, statistically, it's the exact same. So in disk speeds, there are some small performance differences, nothing super significant. Basically, CachyOS will be better at loading large files in multiple chunks all at once, but it will be a little bit slower in writing small files all across the disk. I don't think this will really mean much for most people, but it was interesting to look at anyway. Just for fun, I also measured network speeds, if only because the Tuxedo InfinityBook 16 has an Ethernet pop-out jack, which is 2.5 gig Ethernet, so I wanted to see which speeds I would get with that. On Arch, I got 500 megabits per second down and 488 up, with a very low ping. On CachyOS, I got 510 down and 488 up. No difference here, I wasn't really expecting one. CachyOS doesn't focus on that kind of stuff specifically. Now, the InfinityBook Max 16 also has Wi-Fi 6E, Bluetooth 5.3, and a bunch of other ports, which can be very useful. You have one USB-C 3.2 Gen 2 that does DisplayPort and power delivery. It's hardwired to the Intel GPU. You have a USB-A 3.2 Gen 1 port, an audio and mic jack, 2 more USB-A 3.2 Gen 1 on the right, a full-sized SD card reader, a Thunderbolt 4 port hardwired to the Intel GPU that does DisplayPort and power delivery. You get a port for the barrel charger, and a mini DisplayPort 2.1 hardwired to the NVIDIA GPU, and also an HDMI 2.1 port hardwired to the NVIDIA GPU, which supports variable refresh rate and G-Sync. So nothing to do specifically with CachyOS, but yeah, a bunch of ports on that device, which is pretty cool. So in conclusion, CachyOS does have a performance edge over default Arch, which means it likely has a performance edge over most desktop distros that don't specifically optimize for specific hardware or for low resource usage. You might not notice those improvements in day-to-day use, but in games, it is absolutely noticeable. And on top of that, you get an easier to use and easier to install distro. Arch isn't hard, really, to install. There are plenty of guides. There's the Arch install script that now comes by default in the ISO, which is a sort of graphical interface in the terminal. But having a real graphical tool and having a live ISO you can test is just better in every single way. And CachyOS delivers that. It has more tools pre-installed to manage the things you need to manage on that distro. I think it is a really, really good proposition. So no, CachyOS is not just hype, it actually delivers some solid numbers in terms of gaming. It is better than a default Arch install, and I would assume it is also better than most distros that are all-purpose and not specifically focused on performance. It is still Arch-based, which means it will not be the most stable distro out there. You are on a bleeding-edge rolling release. Your system might break, but for gaming, it's not that much of a problem. You can easily reinstall, grab your games again, and you're good to go. For a more desktop day-to-day system, Arch-based systems, I still don't really recommend them. I just had too many issues in the past with those. Now we still have a bunch of things to cover about the InfinityBook Max 16. First is that display. You might have seen it in the video, but it is gorgeous. That OLED display works really, really well. The colors are fantastic. And in-game, it does give you a really, really nice experience. Viewing angles are really good, but the glare on that display is harsh. The IPS panel that you can get for that same laptop has a matte coating, which does reflect a lot less light, I would assume. So if you need that instead, it is there. The OLED panel goes up to 120 Hz, while the IPS panel goes up to 300 Hz refresh rate, which won't really be useful because you're not going to run many games at 300 frames per second. 120 though is much more achievable, I think. Also, that OLED panel is a fingerprint magnet. Do not touch it at any time. You will struggle to remove those finger marks. It's harsh. Personally, I love the colors of the OLED display. It's bright, it's nice, the blacks are very deep, it's really, really good, but the glare is a bit too much for me. If you use it in an office where the sun doesn't shine directly onto the screen, not a big deal, but if you move it outside, I wouldn't recommend using it. Now we also need to talk about the keyboard and touchpad because both are really, really good. The keyboard here is the German Quartz layout, but of course you can get it in a variety of other layouts if you want. I do like the placement of the arrow keys, which are lowered and separated from the rest. The numpad is always great for Frenchies like me because typing numbers on a French layout is really bad. That numpad helps. The keys feel soft but clicky, they have good enough travel, they're well spaced. It is a nice keyboard. And the touchpad itself is big. It is made of glass, it does gestures, of course. It has integrated buttons, which I prefer personally to separated buttons, but that's a personal preference. It is a dive board mechanism, but you can click it pretty high up without too much force. It is also super smooth, really nice to use, great touchpad. The camera and mic are decent-ish. The integrated webcam does 1080p 30 at maximum. It will need decent lighting conditions to look okay, but it's not a full-blown potato camera, as you can see right now, with even challenging light in the back. It's okay. As per the microphone, it is not awful either, but it is an onboard microphone, so it is pretty tinny. The quality isn't wonderful, but it's not horrendous, and you can actually use it for video conferencing. As usual, you will need to turn the gain way down. Here it is at 21%. Should have set it to 20. I don't know why Linux distros always set that stuff to 100%, because if you crank it all the way up, it is going to screech all the time and not be audible at all. It should be around 20%. It is usable. The speakers are pretty great, not tinny, good bass, powerful. They'll be really nice for gaming, for listening to music, or for watching anything on that laptop. The battery life will be the weak point of that device. It has a 99 watt-hour battery, which you can remove and replace. It is screwed in place, but it is not soldered. But it only gives you about 5 hours of battery life when watching videos in a loop, with the refresh rate lowered to 60 Hz at 50% brightness over Wi-Fi and using the Intel GPU, not the Nvidia one. That CPU eats a lot of battery life, even in power saver mode or whatever, which really makes this laptop into more of a mobile workstation than an actual portable computer that you'll use for a full day of work. The display is high resolution, the CPU sucks a lot of energy, and so obviously that battery will not last as long as you might expect it to. I didn't see a noticeable difference between the battery life on Cachy and Arch. I only ran my videos playing in a loop in Firefox with all the settings I listed once on Arch and on Cachy. Cachy got just a teeny tiny bit more battery life, but it's not statistically significant. To conclude on this laptop, it is very well made with an aluminium case, except for the frame around the display that is plastic. It has small bezels, it has minimal branding, it has a comfortable keyboard, really great I/O, plenty of good ports here, very good performance. It does come at a price. The review unit I got with 16 gigs of RAM, the RTX 5060 and the OLED panel, plus 500 gigs of storage, it will cost you 2,050 euros with the added French VAT of 20%, which means it's 1,810 euros for countries that don't pay that VAT. That's not insane, but it is a hefty sum. The IPS panel will save you 100 euros on the price if you prefer a matte coating at the expense of fantastic colors, but you'll also get higher refresh rate. It's a really good laptop. I love it. Like, those Linux manufacturers have come a long way. They now use aluminium almost everywhere. No longer are the things made out of plastic coated with magnesium. The touchpads are really fantastic. The keyboards are good. And honestly, if I wasn't going to move to my own desktop and I wanted to replace my laptop, this is probably the one I would go with, because my laptop I don't travel much with, and when I do, it's to use it in a stationary position in one place, so I don't need that much battery life. But this is not a mobile PC that you will use for the entire day without having a power outlet at hand. The battery life is not that good. The rest, though, fantastic. So that's it for benchmarking CachyOS and this Tuxedo laptop. Cachy is definitely an interesting distro, and if Arch hasn't let you down before, maybe it's worth a look. The performance benefits are pretty great in gaming. They don't really come with any big detriment. On the contrary, you have an easier to install distro with preloaded tools and utilities that help. It is Arch but user-friendly, with a nice little performance gain on top, or a nice big performance gain on top. I can absolutely recommend it if you're aware that this is an Arch-based distro, meaning you will have to do some more maintenance than just using a regular Ubuntu LTS thing. You'll have to check for updates, you might encounter system breaking bugs that you'll have to debug using the command line. Your mileage may vary. Plenty of Arch users never have a problem with their system. Plenty of Arch users have problems with their system and they're able to fix it, and some people are not able to fix them. If you fall into that category, CachyOS will be as tricky to manage as Arch. But in the meantime, if you're just running a dedicated gaming setup, CachyOS is really a great distro you want to try, and it's probably the one I'm going to start installing on my desktop PC, which I mostly use for gaming currently. Anyway, this will conclude this video. You'll have links down in the description to CachyOS's website, to this InfinityBook Max 16 device if you want to know more about it. And of course, you'll have all the usual YouTube buttons, comment section, and usual links down there as well. Do click on everything. This really helps the channel. Thank you all for watching, and I guess you'll see me in the next one. Bye!